like to thank you all very much. My name is Elizabeth Clower. I'm the person you cannot see on the Zoom little galley screen. I work at the Glen Ellen Public Library, and I would like to thank all of you for coming tonight. People do usually tend to come in sometimes a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes afterwards. I'm going to introduce our two speakers for tonight, and I will do so slowly to give people who are trying to come in time to do so. I did want to draw your attention to the chat. I have put some links in the chat to the Facebook pages, email address, reading list, and then a form if anyone wants to add your name to the form so that you can be added to their email list. So do check the chat, and then at the end of this presentation there will be time for a Q&A, and we will do that through the chat box, not through the Q&A, but through the chat box. So at the end, when we have time for Q&A, go ahead and type your questions or comments into the chat box, and we will be able to have some back and forth using that vehicle at the very end. So I'd like to introduce our speakers for tonight. Donna Limper is a member of the leadership team of the DuPage chapter of Represent Us, the nation's largest grassroots anti-corruption movement. Represent Us works to unite voters across the political spectrum to enact systems change to restore representative democracy. Ben Silver is a community lawyer with Citizens Advocacy Center, whose mission is to build democracy by strengthening the citizenry's capacities, resources, and institutions for self-governance. And I would really like to thank both of them for being here tonight. It should be a really, really interesting presentation. And again, thank all of you for attending. And without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and let the two of them just get right to it. So thank you both.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good evening. Ben and I are pleased to have this opportunity by the Glen Ellen Public Library to discuss the critical role that ethics plays in the anti-corruption movement. Surveys by Pew Research Center indicate that public trust in government is near historic lows. Only 17% of Americans trust the federal government to do what's right just about always, and only 1 in 4 Illinois residents are confident in Illinois state government. That's the lowest among the 50 states by a significant margin. First, let's look at representative democracy at the federal level. In 2014, a study by Princeton and Northwestern University political scientists looked at more than 20 years worth of data to answer a simple question: who influences government policy? This graph summarizes the findings. In an ideal republic, the more popular an idea is, represented by this x-axis, the more likely it is to become law, represented by this y-axis, as shown by the black ideal representation line. But the reality of American politics is that no matter how popular or unpopular an idea is with the public, there is a 30% chance it will become law. Public sentiment's influence is flat or statistically non-significant. However, when economic elites, which is defined as the top 10% of income earners in America, business interests and lobbyists, as shown by this yellow elite representation line, when they want something, the government is much more likely to do it. But when they don't, look at 0.00, they have the power to completely block it from happening. An example of a popular policy that was repealed is net neutrality. Net neutrality requires internet service providers to fairly distribute internet access. In June 2018, the Federal Communications Commission controversially repealed the Net Neutrality Act. The repeal occurred despite over 2 million public comments against repeal, many of them from tech experts, and polling by the University of Maryland that indicated 83% of Americans across party lines support net neutrality. The level of corruption we see today has roots in decades past. In the 60s and 70s, the US government undertook a vast regulatory expansion. They passed the Consumer Bill of Rights, they formed the EPA, and they formed OSHA. The American business community organized to fight back, By 1971, future Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell wrote a memo that galvanized business circles. He stated, and I quote from the memo, "The American economic system is under broad attack and requires mobilization for political combat. Business must learn the lesson that political power is necessary and must be used aggressively in the scale of financing available only through joint effort." This graph from Open Secrets shows the increase in the total cost of elections, both congressional, represented by these tan bars here, and presidential, which is represented by the green bars. And you can see that mega donors have enormous influence over government policy. Further detailed by these statistics, the candidate with the most money wins 91% of the time. In 2016, an average winning Senate candidate spent $10.4 million to get elected. 2/3 of political donations come from a tiny sliver of Americans, just 0.2% of the public. And members of Congress spend 30 to 70% of their time fundraising.
Those statistics don't even reflect the influence of outside spending, political expenditures independent of candidate committees and political parties. In January 2010, the Supreme Court held in Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission that political spending is protected under the First Amendment to the Constitution's freedom of speech. The Citizens United decision allowed for-profit and nonprofit corporations, organizations, and unions to spend unlimited amount of money on political activities as long as there is no direct contribution to a political party or candidate or coordination with a political party or candidate. This graph, also sourced from Open Secrets, shows how outside spending through July 7th of this year. As you can see, outside spending was always a factor, but after the Citizens United decision, it increased exponentially. Outside spending is often what we call dark money. Dark money refers to non-transparent funds spent independently of campaigns to influence elections. It's ads and other spending where you don't know who paid for it. In addition to influencing elections, hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent to cast institutions of government as the enemy of the people, rather than democratic representations of its citizens. Dark money flows to think tanks, academic programs, advocacy groups, lobbyists, synthetic grassroots groups, legal groups to work courts, and model state legislation. To better understand the incredible influence of dark money, we recommend reading the book Dark Money by Jane Mayer, which is on the reading list. Good government advocates often work from the premise and the understanding that corruption, as we commonly know it, as we colloquially know it, is legal in the United States, and we didn't make it illegal. For the purposes of this presentation, we define corruption as using a public office or public funds for private gain. Let's take a look at a few examples. The first, personal money in direct exchange for favors, bribery, is both illegal and rare. However, less direct forms of corruption are common and legal in America. Campaign spending and donations in exchange for favorable policy is legal. Donors may also threaten to use outside spending to launch a smear campaign against politicians who vote against their policy interests. That's one of the most common ways that outside money is used as a form of legal corruption in American politics. Payment later in exchange for favors dominates the lobbying business and is characterized by the term the revolving door. The revolving door is the promise of a lucrative job after a politician leaves office. To put this in perspective, in 1970, only 3% of retiring Congress members became lobbyists. Now, 50% of senators and 42% of House representatives become lobbyists once they leave office. Members of Congress who become lobbyists see their salaries increase on average 1,452%. The revolving door is a very effective form of this legal bribery. Corruption is difficult to dislodge because legal corruption is very profitable. It's enormously profitable. In the last 5 years alone, the 200 most politically active companies in the US spent $5.8 billion influencing our government with campaign contributions and lobbying. Those same companies got $4.4 trillion in taxpayer support, earning a return 750 times their investment. The coronavirus pandemic has created a Washington lobbying boom as companies, interest groups, and entire industries strive to secure a slice of the record multi-trillion-dollar federal financial aid packages meant to stabilize the U.S. economy. Transparency has been a huge problem in tracking that money. In addition to mega donors and dark money outside spending, in 2018, voters faced widespread voter suppression, outdated registration systems and technology, and an election infrastructure that is at risk of manipulation by foreign adversaries. The 2020 election is setting up a legal battle of historic proportions over voting rights. A dramatic increase in voting rights litigation in 2020 is being exacerbated by the coronavirus outbreak, which could require an unprecedented increase in mail-in voting this November. President Trump's campaign and the Republican National Committee have budgeted $20 million for court fights over voting rights. Back in 2018, voters mobilized for reform. As you can see in this graph by the Brennan Center for Justice, voters surged to the polls in the highest number since 1914 and elected a record number of candidates pledged to democracy reform. Over 100 House candidates alone ran on change platforms, and of the 43 Democratic challengers who flipped seats, 25 ran on reforming the system.
New top-down legal standards are being devised to reform the politics industry. In 2011, former Federal Exchange Commission Chairman Trevor Potter crafted the American Anti-Corruption Act in consultation with top constitutional scholars, both conservative and liberal, coming together. This federal act limits or outlaws practices perceived to be major contributors to political corruption. It has three parts. The first part is stop political bribery, so special interests can't use job offers, donations, and outside spending to influence politicians. End secret money so people know who's buying political power, and fix our broken elections so the people, not the political establishment, are the ones in control. In January 2019, the House of Representatives, spurred by those reformers who got elected, introduced and passed H.R. 1, the For the People Act. H.R. 1 is a 700-page comprehensive package of anti-corruption reforms. It has four main parts. Protect voting rights and safety so all voices can be heard and election infrastructure is efficient and secure. Fix campaign financing so politicians are beholden to voters. End partisan gerrymandering so people pick their politicians, not the other way around. And strengthen ethics rules to curb corruption. In March, the Senate introduced this companion bill, S-949. In fact, our Senator Dick Durbin was the one who introduced it. However, while anti-corruption laws are popular among voters on the left and right and everywhere in between, the For the People Act is backed only by House Democrats. And with the Democrats controlling only the House, the legislation is at present a symbolic gesture. Let's take a look at the major ethics provision of the For the People Act so you can decide for yourself whether you find that section to be partisan. Its provisions would slow the revolving door between government officials and lobbyists, expand conflict of interest law, eliminate the use of taxpayer money by politicians to settle sexual harassment claims, ban members of Congress from serving on corporate boards, require major party presidential candidates to publicly disclose their tax returns, overhaul the Office of Government of Ethics to ensure stronger enforcement of ethics rules, and require members of the U.S. Supreme Court to abide by a judicial code of ethics. Right now, Supreme Court justices are the only category of judge not currently covered by a code of conduct. H.R. 1 passed in the House along party lines. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said he would not put the companion bill to a vote on the Senate floor, calling it a one-sided power grab. Whether it's the tenets of the American Anti-Corruption Act or the For the People Act, RepresentUs advocates for unifying voters across the political spectrum and their preferred candidates to seek bipartisan anti-corruption reforms. We believe those reforms would be passable and most enduring. Now let's look at Illinois, or some term it, the state where our governors make our license plates. In 2014, researchers at Indiana University and the University of Hong Kong studied convictions of public officials for corruption as well as patterns in state spending to develop a corruption index. Illinois ranked 4th among the top 10 corrupt states. The study quantified the cost of corruption in those top 10 states to average $1,308 per person annually. The Indiana researchers also found that state spending, which represents our taxes, is higher in corrupt states. The top 10 corrupt states spend more on construction, government wages, law enforcement, and infrastructure, and they tend to spend less on education, healthcare, and social services where there's less opportunity for private gain. Citizen Advocacy Center, Ben's organization, assisted veteran political observers Thomas J. Gradle and Dick Simpson in estimating aggregate annual corruption costs in Illinois at $500 million, and the Better Government Association believes the cost may be in the billions. In a 2011 survey, 3 out of 4 economic development professionals believe that corruption here has a negative impact on business recruiting in Illinois. Attacking corruption here would improve our business climate and bring down state spending with fewer cuts to services that people need. RepresentUs believes bottom-up strategies work best to attack entrenched government corruption. A Bloomberg News study found that throughout our nation's history, passing state laws leads to federal victory when state passage reaches a critical tipping point. The passage of women's suffrage is a perfect example. American female suffrage hit a tipping point here, shown by this yellow line in 1910. Prior to that, you can see the growth in state activity for female suffrage was kind of slow and steady. It started more in these Western states. But once 1910 hit, boom, 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 all of these states just all of a sudden passed female suffrage at once. And then you can see all of this really growth here until federal passage was achieved in 1920. This pattern happened again with interracial marriage and again with same-sex marriage. This bottom-up strategy builds momentum for national reform. That works because the US Constitution gives sole control to the states on how elections are run, even federal elections. When you change election rules in the state, you can change Congress. This bottom-up strategy begins locally in cities and counties where voters have the most control. By first passing these local resolutions and laws, we change our state. And when we change our state, other states follow suit and we change our country. RepresentUs passed the first citywide anti-corruption act in Tallahassee, Florida, and it was led by a coalition that came together of both progressives on the way left and Tea Party activists on the way right. They joined forces, and since they did that, there's been a 100% clean sweep of the city commission. In 2018, voters passed 15 out of 16 anti-corruption campaigns on election day, bringing the 2018 total to 23. That's the most anti-corruption reforms passed in a single year in US history. They include many tenets of the American Anti-Corruption Act. Comprehensive anti-corruption laws were passed in Alaska, North Dakota, Missouri, and Denver. Anti-gerrymandering laws in Ohio, Michigan, Colorado, and Utah. Ranked choice voting passed in the state of Maine and the city of Memphis. Ethics and lobbying reform were passed, automatic voter registration and campaign finance laws, and transparency laws. In 2019, Maine became the 16th state to pass automatic voter registration. New York City passed ranked choice voting, which tripled its usage in the United States. And New Jersey and San Francisco passed dark money laws. Many of these successes were achieved with ballot initiatives. Ballot initiatives are a form of direct democracy, where a petition signed by a certain minimum number of registered voters can put anti-corruption laws directly to a public vote. In short, ballot initiatives bypass entrenched politicians, to make corruption illegal. Thousands of cities and 24 states, all of these outlined in blue, allow some form of a ballot initiative or direct democracy, and note that Illinois is highlighted in blue. One thing you have to recognize is that corruption is neither Democratic nor Republican. It flows to the party and the people in power. and that when you try and fight it, anti-corruption success often faces pushback. In response to reform success in 2018, in 2019, legislators in 16 states introduced 120 bills to make ballot initiative hurdles more difficult. As I mentioned before, Illinois is technically one of the 24 states that allow ballot initiatives, but we give Illinois a big black X. And the reason for that is that citizens here may only initiate constitutional amendments that are structural and procedural in nature. And the process is so prohibitively difficult that many initiative scholars do not truly count Illinois as an initiative state. Twice, reform groups tried to overhaul redistricting or gerrymandering through the petition process, but were struck down by the courts. Without a ballot initiative process, Illinois citizens must work with legislators to change systems in our state. In the 1970s, Mayor Daley taunted reformers, "You just ain't got the votes." Getting the votes to reform government in Illinois requires a majority of voters to demand reform. Public pressure is most effective in election years. If a significant number of voters tell incumbents and challengers they expect ethics reform, especially in an election year, those lawmakers would feel the pressure and in turn apply it to their party leaders. We can't stress enough that anti-corruption efforts need to overwhelm elected officials with public support. Given the national percentages of political identities, 29% Democrat, 26% GOP or Republican, and 42% independent, no one group can do it alone. I'd like to point out that this independent group, if you really poll them, they aren't like completely independent. You have a certain percentage that lean Democratic or to the left, a certain percentage that lean to the right, and then a certain percentage that are truly independent and flip-flop. But they would be kind of, I would characterize them as centrist, and I'd like you to remember that 42% number. A unified left-right groundswell of overwhelming and unceasing public support would give legislators the political cover to buck the system, and without it, too many of them will not risk their careers to do the right thing. Political unity does work. In North Dakota, 2 women, 1 Republican and 1 Democrat, admired each other, and although they had vastly different views, they decided to seek common ground and put country over party. Together, they spearheaded a cross-partisan activist group. That group organized to successfully pass the North Dakota Anti-Corruption Amendment. This legislation is the most comprehensive anti-corruption amendment in US history. It increases transparency, roots out conflicts of interest, restricts lobbyist gifts, bans foreign money from elections, prevents the personal use of campaign money, closes the revolving door, and holds public officials accountable. By the way, these 2 ladies dubbed themselves the badass grandmas of North Dakota. One thing I want you to ask yourself is, did you hear about this in any news reports, either newspaper or on television? And if you didn't hear about it, why not? In their book Wedged, Eric Frog and Nat Green proposed that the national attention on different political issues tends to center on the extreme poles of the left and the right. However, if you actually poll Americans on policy, when you drill down to the policy level, their opinions on any given political issue tend to be spread throughout the political spectrum, lumping in the middle. They created this green fog curve to challenge the conventional wisdom that Americans are hyperpolarized. They assert that American political dysfunction is driven by wedging techniques that have empowered the fringes of political ideology and destroyed the majority middle ground. They believe that this majority needs to reject this false split identity and start coming together and recentering politics on American core values. And they need to actively demand that the systems controlled by the 2 major parties are modified. You see that 2-party system failure thought echoed in another book that just came out recently called The Politics Industry, Catherine Gell is a former CEO, and Michael Porter is a very well-known Harvard business professor. They believe the two-party system is failing America. They believe our political duopoly is focused on protecting itself and is dragging the nation down on many economic measures. Major party candidates are chosen to appeal to their party's extremes because extreme voters are those most motivated to vote in primaries. Primary turnout in America is shockingly low. In addition, our election system inhibits competition. Third-party candidates and independents face enormous hurdles just to get on the ballot. Outsiders who try to run are frequently subjected to challenges that drag on for months, often denying them a place on the ballot. That process tends to produce candidates who are either beholden to the special interests who fund their campaign or who might actually support a very extreme viewpoint. As Gell and Porter put it, the parties differentiate themselves by competing on ideology, but not solutions. Bipartisan compromise, such as we had in the 80s and 90s, has become a dirty practice, and the authors offered this quote: "Eventually, change must be enacted by a majority in the democratically elected legislative bodies. It is here that bipartisan, pro-problem solving, consensus-seeking moderates are crucial for delivering practical solutions." The Reunited States Project is a helpful initiative in building a left-right movement, and their Bridge Alliance initiative is working to build a transpartisan movement to bridge the partisan divide. To be transpartisan means valuing inclusive solutions that transcend and include all political party positions and promote cross-spectrum collaboration for the benefit of all. To be transpartisan movement, we're going to contrast bipartisan with transpartisan. Transpartisan is characterized by the following words and phrases. It is relational, meaning it develops relationships between people who have different opinions. It's not transactional. It seeks common and higher ground and focuses on collaboration. It has multi-stakeholder leaders from many groups and represents we the people. It engages in dialogue characterized by civility, dignity, and compassion. It rejects the notion that we are tribal and recognizes that in fact we are integral parts of a whole.
In addition to cross-party anti-corruption unity, scandals work too. Corruption in Illinois has been a bipartisan problem from the earliest history of the state, but scandals have propelled reforms in the past, and the opportunity to propel reforms is upon us once again. Following the Blagojevich scandal, a 2009 Illinois Reform Commission issued a 95-page report focused on procurement, campaign finance, and transparency reforms. Unfortunately, only a few critical reforms were adopted at that time. This year, a federal investigation into an 8-year bribery scheme involving the public utility ComEd explicitly underscored the cost of corruption. In exchange for a deferred prosecution deal requiring the company to pay a $200 million fine, ComEd admitted to providing jobs, contracts, and payoffs to House Speaker Madigan's associates. In exchange, ComEd received at least $150 million in legislative benefits to its bottom line. Sharp increases in rates affected our electrical bills, yours and mine. What will happen this time? The aggressive federal corruption probe began in 2019 and pursued other Illinois Democrats, including Representative Luis Arroyo, Senator Martin Sandoval, and Senator Tom Cullerton. With multiple corruption investigations in both Chicago and Springfield, lawmakers were under pressure to enact ethics reform. The Center for Illinois Politics created a bar graph breaking down the 92 ethics reforms bills that were introduced in 2019. As you can see here, we have a breakdown of some of those bills by issue. The most popular was term limits, redistricting, elections and campaigns. Lobbyist registration was also popular, ethics and investigations, and the revolving door prohibition, which would prevent lawmakers from going and lobbying right away, was another popular one. Almost all the bills in the previous slide were stuck in two committees, the House Rules Committee and the Senate's Assignments Committee. These two committees cull bills that are similar and decide which bills will advance. If a bill doesn't receive enough votes, the bill is stuck in committee until members vote on it again. Since revotes are rare, a bill can die here. It can only be revived through re-referrals, but then it can be stuck again. 37 of the 89 bills were re-referred with no committee assignment happening after that. Only 5 bills made it through both chambers. 2 ethics reform bills were significant. SB 1639 increases transparency to better track lobbying activities. The other created a joint commission on ethics and lobbying reform. Governor Pritzker said he wanted to follow up with a more comprehensive ethics reform package in 2020. A report was due in March, but then of course the pandemic struck us here in Illinois. The Joint Commission on Ethics and Lobbying Reform was created to restore public trust. Just Democracy Illinois, a group of good government advocates that both Citizen Advocacy Center and Represent DuPage are members of, addressed the commission and were united on 2 major goals. State lawmakers should be prohibited from lobbying other governments on behalf of private clients, and they shouldn't be allowed to work as lobbyists immediately after serving in the General Assembly. Marie Dillon from the Better Government Association gave an important speech which included this excerpt on the real problem, and you can see that on your screen, and I'll read it as well. She said, "The problem isn't lobbyists. The problem is the transactional relationship between special interests and the people who write our laws and set our government policies. When the federal investigation is over, I predict a lot of bad actors will be exposed, but untouched. Because tolerance for self-dealing behavior is baked into our laws, that's the big picture here. That's what we need to fix. However, due to the pandemic, the Joint Commission on Ethics and Lobbying Reform has not issued the report that was promised in March of this year. We are still waiting." On August 13th, 16 Democratic lawmakers from both the Illinois Senate and House of Representatives unveiled 9 ethics proposals as part of a legislative package that would start to bring Illinois into line with ethics rules in states across the country. Moreover, the lawmakers believe the following ethics reform measures could receive bipartisan support in the upcoming veto session this November. Those measures are: 1, prohibit legislator lobbyists; 2, stop the legislator lobbyist revolving door; 3, better define who is a lobbyist; 4, fuller disclosure of outside income; 5, establish an official censure process; 6, measures to strengthen the office of Legislative Inspector General; 7, end the exemption for General Assembly employees from the Human Rights Act; 8, I can count, establish term limits for legislative leaders; 9, establish a process for removal of leaders and committee chairs. This is a big deal, and we need to take action. We ask you to call your Illinois Senate and House representatives to urge the commission, the Joint Commission on Ethics and Lobbying Reform and the General Assembly to turn these 9 specific ethics reforms proposals into law. Add that we expect broad bipartisan support of these laws to show the taxpayers of Illinois, its elected officials, are serious about reforming our state government.
To reiterate, bottom-up strategies are advocated by RepresentUs, start at the state level to work for national reforms, and at the local level to pass state reforms. Here in DuPage County, we want to successfully lobby the DuPage County Board to strengthen the DuPage County Ethics Ordinance of 2012. DuPage County is the 2nd largest county in Illinois, and if we can initiate reform here, we can help spur reform efforts throughout our state. We submitted the following 6 proposals to the DuPage County Board. Ensure the Investigator General's office is both independent and effective. Limit political contributions for county vendors and political appointees to reduce pay-to-play. Ban conflicts of interest and property tax laws. Increase the lobbying prohibition or the revolving door from 1 to 5 years. Limit nepotism and institute penalties for ethics violations. Let's look at our proposals in more detail. The DuPage County Investigator General examines the government actions of county government. All the proposed changes we recommend are based on recommendations taken from this report published by the Business and Professional People for the Public Interest. It's basically a guide to best practices. The first change we propose is for an external committee to identify nominees for selection and then appointment by the board. In simpler terms, you don't want politicians to pick who polices them. Second, we should ensure the Investigator General's office is independent and that the Investigator General can be removed only for cause. Third, we should allow complainants to file anonymously with whistleblower protection against retaliation This is not the case now. If you think about it, it's the people who work at the county who are in the best position to see things that are irregular. And if they can't speak up because they're afraid they're losing their job, they won't. Fourth, we propose instituting procedures for presenting evidence, recommending disciplinary action, requiring written responses from agencies under investigation. And last, we recommend preparing an analysis of why those violations took place and recommend structural reforms to prevent a repetition of any misconduct. In 2010, following the Blagojevich scandal, DuPage County imposed a campaign limit of $1,000 on county vendors. But in 2013, the pay-to-play limit was increased to $5,000. Our proposed change would make it unlawful for companies to receive a county vendor contract above $10,000 within 4 years of contributing to a county candidate or to a PAC that gives to a county candidate. We believe enacting this law would survive a challenge even in the Citizens United era because courts are reluctant to strike down restrictions on government contractor campaign contributions just because of pay-to-play. Conflicts of interest by Chicago aldermen who've used their official offices to enhance their property tax and other business income have been in the news lately. In July, the Chicago City Council passed a prohibition on council members holding outside jobs that conflict with their duties of public servants, such as serving as a property tax appeals lawyer. We propose adding a similar provision on county officials practicing property tax appeals law or other types of instances in which the county is a party and the client's interests oppose those of the county. DuPage is a taxing body, so it's especially important at the board level. The revolving door, which is, again, to remind you when special interests offer public officials and their staff high-paying lobbying jobs, can occur at the federal, state, and local level. A public citizen analysis examined revolving door rules in all 50 states. Only 7 states have 0 limits, and Illinois is one of them. Hopefully, with the ComEd scandal, this will change. DuPage currently has a 1-year ban on the revolving door. We would like to expand the ban to 5 years, which would be 1 year more than a 4-year term of office. We also propose specifically prohibiting nepotism. We believe nepotism is inconsistent with a healthy ethics environment. It creates what appears to be dynasties at best and employment for incompetent relatives at worst. It also discriminates against people who are not in a position to get government jobs from members of their families. This discrimination applies to both individuals and to ethnic, racial, and religious groups. Historically, Illinois did not have explicit prohibitions against nepotism, but in 2018, Governor Rauner issued an executive order banning nepotism at Illinois state agencies. We believe DuPage County should have an express ordinance against nepotism. In the wake of corruption scandals involving Chicago Alderman Edward Burke, the Chicago Board of Ethics slapped him with the maximum penalty of $2,000. New York can impose fines of $25,000, and other cities impose fines of up to 3 times the financial benefit of wrongdoing. Noting that Chicago fines are among the lowest of its big city peers, the Chicago Board of Ethics proposed fines up to $20,000 or more, but they only decided at the end to increase the limit from $2,000 to $5,000. An increasingly angry public is demanding an end to Illinois' history of corruption. And we believe that raising the fines is a good way to counter that. We believe it's time for all levels of government to impose significant fines for ethics violations. And hey, considering our state, it could be a great source of revenue. Our proposal for DuPage County would levy fines up to $20,000 per violation, or 3 times the financial benefit gained or loss averted if quantifiable. Realizing reforms in states such as Illinois that lack forceful ballot initiatives is very difficult. We're dependent on elected officials to enact reforms that may hurt them. In addition to a multi-county, bottom-up approach to reform, such as strengthening the DuPage County Ethics Ordinance, we could adopt a technique used in other states to bring reform issues to the ballot box. Pennsylvania and Virginia are both non-initiative states who have instituted clean money squads to fight corruption statewide. Clean money squads are nonpartisan, nonprofit 501c4 organizations that connect voters with reform candidates across the political spectrum. They identify, but they do not endorse anti-corruption candidates. To qualify as a Clean Money Squad member, candidates and office holders must formally endorse and commit to actively fight for specified anti-corruption initiatives. Those corruption initiatives are different per state, so Pennsylvania's initiatives will be different than Virginia's, which might be different than Illinois'. And they also commit to running transparent campaigns that do not accept special interest donations. Mahatma Gandhi, who wrested control of his nation from the most powerful empire in the world, commented, "Without a paper or a journal of some kind, you cannot unite a community." The Fulcrum provides digital news focused exclusively on American democracy reform efforts. It reports news from across the country on money in politics, redistricting, voting rights, election access, government ethics, civic engagement, and the imbalance of powers. We highly recommend signing up at fulcrum.us if you're serious about joining the anti-corruption movement. That's where you would hear about things like the North Dakota Anti-Corruption Act. There's a lot of work being done in the democracy reform arena that you do not hear about. In addition to subscribing to the Fulcrum, Represent Us volunteers monitor many anti-corruption news outlets and democracy reform organizations, and these are a few of them. Nationally, there are two main coalitions, the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers. These groups tend to want to unite voters, as I'm describing as in Represent Us, so that includes Represent Us, American Promise, Bridge Alliance, Fair Vote, Open Primaries, Unite America. So they believe we need to unite people and maybe enact reform from the middle. Take Back Our Republic is probably the most conservative of the groups. So if you tend to be very right-leaning, this might be the group for you. Declaration for American Democracy is a coalition that includes a lot of nonpartisan organizations like Brennan Center, Public Citizen, Common Cause, and the League. But it also includes very left-leaning organizations. So if you tend to be more progressive, you might be interested in checking out the Declaration for American Democracy Coalition. Here in Illinois, Citizen Advocacy Center, Ben's organization, and all the local chapters of Represent Us belong to the Just Democracy Coalition, which is a group of 28 organizations, includes organizations such as Common Cause, Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, the League, Change Illinois, Reform for Illinois, and Better Government Association. The pandemic has slowed down the anti-corruption movement a bit, but Represent Us's innovative Action Brigade is a national team of volunteers helping spur anti-corruption campaigns across the country. The Action Brigade uses technologies such as phone and text banking to support campaigns even from thousands of miles away without having to leave your home. Represent Us is constantly evaluating anti-corruption campaigns, looking for campaigns that are at the cross-section of policy impact and political viability. You can sign up at Represent Us website. Current campaigns include ending gerrymandering in Virginia and Missouri, ranked choice voting in Massachusetts, and open primaries, ranked choice voting, and election protection in Alaska. Alaska is a hotbed of anti-corruption reforms. There's a lot of cool stuff going on there.
Sorry, I was still muted. A new report by Public Agenda, Greater Voice, Greater Impact, found that over 2/3 of Americans say they believe it's mostly our responsibility to help find solutions. It's not enough to just vote and pay taxes. Here's how you can contribute to help create solutions. Locally, tell your friends and family about our proposed changes to the DuPage County Ethics Ordinance of 2012 and ask them to, 1, contact DuPage County board members and their challengers, and 2, express support for the reforms on board members' social media.
You can also join the anti-corruption movement through any of those national coalition groups, or you can join our local chapter of Represent Us. Represent Us will be convening 2 teams. We're going to split into a national team, which will train people to be part of the Action Brigade, spurring anti-corruption reforms across the country. And that team will also look at creating bipartisan discussion around the For the People Act, so that we start to educate voters about the tenets of the American Anti-Corruption Act and For the People Act, and really find common ground between the left and the right. The second team, the Illinois team, will help support the Just Democracy Coalition when they look at campaign finance and ethics reform here in our state. Represent DuPage has 2 Facebooks. We have a Represent Us DuPage group and a Represent Us DuPage page, and a page, a group and a page.
And of course, you can also become an active citizen by watching public meetings. We recommend that you pick a local public body and start observing their meetings as much as you can. You'll start to see patterns, how things are supposed to work, and be able to tell when things go wrong and when there are things that need citizen input to correct in terms of accountability. As we enter our Q&A, I want to first mention, as you'll see in the chat, that though we are a legal organization, when CAC does a forum like this, it's of course meant to be educational in nature and should not be considered legal advice. However, you can contact us for any questions you have about government transparency and accountability, including questions about registering to vote, voting by mail, voting early, anything you have before the election in November. We are here to help. You can find us at our website at citizenadvocacycenter.org or reach out to me. My email address is in the chat box.
We put together a recommended reading list, which the Glen Ellyn Public Library has so graciously added to, which is also in the chat box. As we take questions, I'm going to leave some of our books that have helped inform this presentation, in case some of you have read them and would like to mention them. And now Elizabeth is going to kind of be our moderator for the Q&A through the chat. You can ask questions of either Ben or myself. And so we welcome any questions, comments. Thank you for attending.
Wonderful. So I see someone says they can't see anything in the chat box. There we go.
I just re-put it in there, and I will put our disclaimer in there again as well, which has my email address. So.
Wonderful. Okay, so now hopefully everyone can see all of the links in the chat box. And if you have any questions, please do feel free to write them in the chat box. We have some time. And I will go ahead and read out the question out loud, and then Donna and Ben can respond to them. So sometimes it takes people a little while. Oh, no, we got one right away. Have any of our county board candidates expressed support for this reform agenda?
You know, I'm going to take that one. Represent Us does not believe in endorsing, or we don't either help or hurt any specific person. We change systems. So I can't answer that question because it would appear to indicate sort of some kind of favoritism or endorsement. We do lobby them and present them the information. It's up to them. The only thing I would encourage you to do would be to contact your specific. DuPage County is split into 6 districts, and you can find on your voter registration card which district you are in. Each district has 3 board members. So I would encourage you to contact all 3 of the board members and any challengers and express your support for ethics reform.
It sounds like this next question might have been already answered, but perhaps not. Have you spoken to the DuPage elected officials about this agenda?
We have lobbied and sent the proposals incomplete to every single elected board member who is currently serving, as well as all of the candidates.
Okay.
So they will know what you're talking about if you lobby them on it.
If you call, they will know what you're talking about.
Any other questions? Give people a minute to think and to type. Did you get any response? I'm assuming, did you get any response when you spoke to the officials?
Again, I'm not going to comment on that because I don't want to, did we get any response? I'm not going to comment on that. I'm just, again, it's up to us to create political pressure and to suggest systems changes. So I can't comment on that, particularly in an election. We're kind of in the midst of an election. So I don't feel comfortable commenting on that right now.
Okay.
I can say just a little more in that the response was not as strong as I would have liked. And I think that's a fair thing to say and nonpartisan. So,
okay.
Luke, Luke wants to know, in the interest of catering to today's society, if someone were to choose one or two of these recommended reading books, which one would you recommend?
it's a great question.
Ben, do you have a favorite? I know I do right now.
Why don't you go ahead? I'm looking at the list again just to try and think if I do.
Yeah, the one that came out, the one that I'm going to point out a couple because I can't just pick one. It's like a mom. I love all my children. The politics industry, that's third one down, that is very, very recent, and it's really galvanized the reform movement. Represent Us has really gotten behind the politics industry. So if I can only pick one, I'm going to pick that one. I also like to point out that the ones at the bottom, there's a lot to reform movement besides politics. It encompasses economics and journalism as well. So, you know, antitrust has, industry consolidation has a role in the reduction of democracy, as well as I attended a recent lecture called "The Pandemic as a Media Extinction Event." Democracy doesn't exist without the fourth estate. And so journalism and attacks on journalism also play a role. So I do like these ones on the bottom as well. Ben?
I would say dark money is really important. Just understanding where the messaging that you're hearing is coming from, understanding that there is even if you knew where that surface spending was coming, there are a lot of layers to it. I think that's a good book that helps start to explain just how much money is a corrupting influence in our politics and our elections and in our policy. I see Miriam had a question there, right?
She wanted to know, what are some of the persuasive arguments to convince our elected officials?
Ben.
Sure, yeah.
Please.
You know, honestly, I think one of the best ones is that ethics reform is popular. I think conveying that can be very difficult sometimes. But the fact of the matter is there's always strong bipartisan support for ethics reform. It's passing these things is popular. Specifically in DuPage County right now, I think that their feeling, at least maybe until this year, was that they had done enough with the 2012 reforms, which we know were fairly toothless. And that was really what we were kind of getting at with this package, was they needed to put some teeth on the reforms that they put in there. In addition to some more provisions, they just needed a way to actually do something with what's there. And, you know, I think when you look at what's happening in the state, it's easy to link those two things together to say, look, this is in the news. People hate this. What they like is ethics reform. So I think it is incredibly popular. I think that's one of the best arguments you can make. It's obviously good government as well. Certain politicians will find that persuasive in and of itself, and some, you know, won't.
Donna, anything to add?
I mean, I would concur with everything that Ben said. I think that, you know, Represent Us doesn't believe that people are, you know, that politicians are bad or corrupt. They believe that the system is corrupt, and that the only way to change the system is a groundswell of voter contact, and that voters need to initiate reform. So it isn't enough to just for Represent Us to send these proposals. It really requires all of you to demand reform. That's the only way I can say that.
We have an interesting question here. It says, my brother is very far right. I lean left. Is there a book on the list or more than one, that might resonate with him?
You know what, with Thanksgiving coming up, I've been doing a lot of work on bridging the partisan divide, because Represent Us believes it's absolutely critical to unite voters across the political spectrum to fight corruption together. And so I have been working, I worked with like 3 different organizations. The one that impressed me the most, it's not a book, it's an organization called Braver Angels. I don't know if you could type that in the chat, Braver Angels. And they have a really cool skill training that it's online. If you type in Braver Angels skills, you can sign up with your relative who's on the right and you're, I assume, on the left, and you can go together to the skills training, and they teach you how to understand and talk to each other and find common values without sort of being stuck in these ideological extremes. So it helps you to understand the perspective of other people, and because it tends to be very value driven. And when you drill down to why people have their different ideologies, we're much more likely to be able to come together. So I highly recommend Braver Angels skill training. The other one is there's a living room conversations you can participate in. I've participated in a bunch of those where you can not only talk to people across the country, but you can talk to people in other countries, because other countries also deal with corruption. So, I mean, the last one I was on, I was talking to a guy in England, and those are really interesting to talk about different topics like that. But Braver Angels is the one that I think, I should mention, it was started by a marriage counselor, a guy who's a psychologist who specializes in marriage counseling. And he decided to bring his marriage counseling skills to bring blue and red people together. So
I would say Wedged could be helpful potentially too. That might not necessarily convince people to move from the extremes, though. But it might help help someone understand that, you know, the country is largely in this middle. Like Donna mentioned, there is just a ton of common ground. Anyone who's ever volunteered for a campaign can tell you, like, where they're going out there and canvassing or on the phone, when they start talking to the supposed persuadable voters, there's a lot of common ground. People believe in a lot of the same things. Successful politicians will we use that rhetoric about how much we have in common, and that's absolutely true. We do have more in common than we have differences, despite what our very intense politics might look like right now.
Okay, Miriam has another question. She wants to know if you would support a suburban inspector general.
Well, we have an investigator general that we pay for in DuPage who earns about $250,000 a year. So, and we also have an ethics commission in DuPage County. So, and I should mention that the reason we also looked at the it's called the Inspector General in Chicago, but in DuPage County, for some reason, I don't know why, they call it the Investigator General. So we have an Investigator General. The reason we also wanted to look at that office was there was a corruption scandal, I think, in the city of Aurora. I'm not going to touch on that too much, but the response to that was to ask to share our Investigator General with the city of Aurora. So we have a sharing agreement for the cost of that Investigator General. So it behooves us to strengthen that office, because it doesn't just look at the DuPage County Board, it now looks at the entire city of Aurora.
Miriam, do you mean like a state agency or an independent state hired? Because that's, I think, what we're getting at largely with the Inspector General, is you just want that independence that right now the DuPage Inspector General just does. The office doesn't really have the teeth to independently investigate, to impose or really strongly recommend any kind of fixes or punishments. Like in Chicago, yeah. I mean, so the Chicago Inspector General is much more independent and has more teeth. And I think, whether it is through the county setting it up themselves or another mechanism. It's that independence that we have to have. And that doesn't just go for DuPage County. I don't think we're trying to single out DuPage County here and, you know, looking at the rest of the state, I don't think we could single out DuPage County, but that independence should happen everywhere.
I should point out that in the ethics, well, let me go back to the 9-point ethics reform at the state. Mm-hmm. Where was that? Let's see, hold on one second. Oh, here. There. There was measures to strengthen the Office of Legislative Inspector General. That's a huge one in Springfield because right now that office is not independent. So, and they have, in order to expose corruption, they have to get permission from the legislators, which is an absurd, right? Ben, you comment on that better than me.
Well, no, yeah, I mean, it really speaks to the fact that it's not at all independent. And I mean, you can come up with examples of that in so many different areas, and it isn't even just in law. You can think of like corporate governance and things where the oversight, you know, it's the fox is watching the hen house. Well, maybe it's not quite like that. I mean, the inspectors general are usually good and they want to be independent. But if they have this oversight of themselves, if the people who they're supposed to be investigating have that much power over them, they're never going to truly be independent, and never have the degree of objectivity that they need to perform successfully.
That's why there's this handcuff here. So.
And I see Maria mentioned that it was in the office that was empty for years when sexual harassment complaints were made. I think that's right. I can't say for sure, but I do recall that. And yeah, I mean, it's been a barrage of ethics complaints at the state level. You know, I think a lot of the focus is obviously on the House Speaker. He's been there a very long time, and that's sort of the popular thing. But it almost takes the focus off the fact that we have tons of state legislators and longtime staffers who have been caught up in these things. And it's just an absolute deluge of ethics violations recently.
Stephanie actually put a note in here. She wants to know if you could go back over the transpartisan versus bipartisan characteristics.
Sure. Hold on one second. Let me find that. Oh, wait a second. Hold on. Where was that? There. This one, is this?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. So, right now, people talk about when you're bringing people together that we want to be bipartisan, bringing the duopoly together. You know, there's more than just a duopoly. Like I said, the reason that the point I forgot to make that point was that the independent people who classify themselves as independents, it's a growing percentage. So people are leaving the two parties because they don't feel the parties represent their views anymore, and they don't really have a place to go. And it goes back to the green fog curve, where the majority, it's like distributed along kind of a normal bell curve. And so a transpartisan definition sort of, I think, better fits the reality of that political ideological distribution. So it implies that when we work together to find common ground solutions, we work together based on relationships that we develop. I just attended, let's see, Citizen Advocacy Center had a really good Bridging the Partisan Divide, and there was an evangelical woman who gave an interesting phrase, and she said social justice is equal to 1 million acts of relational justice. In other words, relationships with people form the bedrock of a larger societal movement. And so transpartisanship really focuses on developing relationships among people with different ideologies, values, attitudes, opinions. It seeks common and higher ground. It doesn't devolve into our differences, and it doesn't devolve into attacks. We collaborate. It's not a negotiation, is kind of win-lose. Transpartisanship focuses on win-win. It includes multi-stakeholder leaders from many different perspectives. it truly tries to represent democracy and that it tries to represent we the people. I would characterize it with the phrase, the greatest good. We try to maximize the greatest good. It engages in dialogue. Again, debate is a win-lose, you know, definition. Dialogue is a win-win. And then we are extremely civil, dignified. We engage compassion in each other, and we reject this tribal, dual split, extreme thing. Again, why are we not hearing about these corruption reforms, and why are we being kept apart? You have to ask yourself that. In whose interest is it for us to be tribal? Isn't it much better if we recognize that people from different parts of the country, that people with different upbringings would have different opinions, and that's okay. And that we are integral parts of an American whole, because we do have an American character, and we do have American values that all of us share.
And I just want to point out that there are institutional as well as political reasons that we have this bipartisan system, and you know, some of those things are hard to overcome. We have a system where, you know, 50% plus one vote wins, and that is embedded in our constitutional system. That's, you know, not something that's going to change easily. However, there are many ways that can be addressed in, you know, in smaller doses to get more towards transpartisanship and make people work together. Donna mentioned that New York City passed, did they do ranked choice voting, was it?
Yes.
Or was it?
Yes.
So, you know, some places do instant runoff, some places ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting is wonderful, wonderful, wonderful for advancing independence and third-party candidates and small parties and everything else, because instead of feeling like you're throwing your vote away if you vote for this party that you feel doesn't have a chance, you get to vote for them, and if they don't hit that sort of threshold, depending how the system's set up, you get to rank choice. So you can still vote for one of the people who you do think might win, and your vote's going to count. And what can end up happening there is enough people say, well, actually, I really like this person who's supposed to not have a shot, that it can end up that person wins or ends up in that second round, and it builds those parties. It builds those independent candidacies. So ranked choice voting is a great system to really break through, so that we can move even beyond bipartisanship into transpartisanship, into a system where more voices, where it's really more than two voices having a say. And in addition to New York City doing that, Maine actually did that statewide, and for federal offices, and that survived the court challenge. And actually the presidential election this year in Maine will include ranked choice voting. That's
right. The other thing I want to point out was this, that I said that RepresentUs is big with, and it's also the one that if you could only read one book, I would read this. In terms of political innovation, ranked choice voting is it's like at the top of their list. These two, Catherine Gell and Michael Porter, they're both business people, and so they use competition theory, like business competition theory, as the innovations to break this duopoly that they believe is harming us. And so they are big on open primaries, top 4 ranked choice voting. So that was, they think, would be competition back, and it would allow people to have a lot more choice at the ballot box that might represent what they feel. So like I said, those 42% of people who don't feel represented by the parties, that also might be driving down, you know, people voting if they don't see somebody, a candidate that represents what they want. And so they're like, wow, I don't want to vote for either one of those people, you know. So these political innovations that Gell and Porter have suggested, and that RepresentUs supports just about all of them, a lot of these political innovations were in the American Anti-Corruption Act.
Stephanie wants to know if you can put up the slide that includes the 9-point ethics plan. Put that back up. And while you're getting to that, I just wanted to remind everybody that this entire program is being recorded, and it will be available on the library's website. It might take a couple days to get up, but if you go to gepl.org, under the programs and events, there's a page called Did You Miss It? And it will also be put up on the library's social media platforms as well. So
thank you, Elizabeth.
Remind everyone about that.
This is the 9-point ethics package.
give Stephanie a minute to look at that. And while Stephanie's taking a look at that, Luke had a comment. He said, is it, and Luke, I'm going to go ahead and put in accurate instead of fair. Is it accurate to say that corruption, conflicts of interest, and often unethical practices are currently legal and incidentally considered just, in quotation marks, in our current legislative and judicial system?
Bit of a loaded question. I mean, definitely, there's certainly a good amount of what I think would commonly be referred to, and I try to be careful with this in the presentation because I am a lawyer and I don't want to say that, hey, all corruption is legal or something, but there are things that are commonly referred to as corruption that, you know, the person on the street would think of as a corrupt practice that is perfectly legal. Some of that is built into legislation. Some of that comes through because of complicated webs of court cases. I think maybe the best example of that might be this case that came out of Virginia that the Supreme Court ruled on a few years ago. The governor of Virginia, I think it was his wife, got tens of thousands of dollars in gifts for access to him and other officials. So people were giving like jewelry and things and getting in return meetings set up so they could meet with the governor and other people. And the Supreme Court ruled that essentially the language of Virginia's ban on that was too broad, and that actually under the First Amendment it went too far, and they struck down the law. So he got away with it. I mean, and the people who what I think, again, the person on the street would say, hey, that's bribery, they got away with it. I mean, it's yeah, so that kind of thing is absolutely out there, and it takes much more diligent attention and detailed lawmaking and perceptive lawmaking to really overcome things like that. Conflicts of interest, yeah, there are all kinds of conflicts in there. Donna mentioned, and I think it's right in here in these 9, the employment restrictions. The biggest one we often talk about is the property tax appeals attorneys who are working in the legislature. It's a business worth, I think, billions with a B in this state. A bunch of legislators are involved in it themselves. Their friends and donors are, and it is seen as one of the reasons that we have such high property taxes. Not that I'm railing against high property taxes, but the fact is we're really reliant on property taxes. Our school funding formula is built upon property taxes. And a lot of reformers see the fact that people are practicing this and making just fortunes off of it and then legislating as a huge, huge, huge impediment to overcoming that and seeking reform. And maybe one of the worst parts of that is we end up with a really unequal education system, because when you're basing funding on local property values and property taxes instead of going with a statewide funding formula, you end up with huge, huge, huge disparities on per pupil spending in the schools.
Okay, I'm not currently seeing any other questions in the chat. Maybe we can give people 1 or 2 minutes to see if there's any last minute questions they want to ask or a comment they want to make. Anything at all, go ahead and pop it in the chat.
While we're waiting, thank you all for joining us. And again, I want to encourage you to reach out if you have questions about the upcoming election. Please, please, please plan on voting early, plan on voting by mail. If you have any questions about doing that, we are working hard to have all those answers. We want to make sure that everyone can vote safely and that we have high turnout and everything else in this challenging year.
And then I'd like to end with just asking that you contact your county board member to encourage them to strengthen the ethics ordinance, and then contact your Illinois House and Senate representative to encourage them that you want stronger ethics package.
I have also copy and pasted the URL. If you want to have your name added to the email list, I have put that URL at the very bottom of the chat, so that should be right in front of you. And I am doing the same thing right now with the email address. So it should be right there in front of you. So if you want to stay in touch, you have multiple ways of doing that. Don't forget about the links to their Facebook page and group up towards the top of the chat. And let me see. I think those were all the links. Yeah, I think those were all the links. Oh, one more very quickly. I'm going to copy and paste Ben's email as well. Ben, is that okay with you?
Absolutely.
I'm going to copy and paste that and put that down here at the very bottom of the chat so it's nice and easy for everyone to find. And unless we have any other questions, I want to thank both of you very, very much. It's a hugely important issue this year in particular, but I think, of course, always in all years, and especially here in Illinois, we have such a lovely history. And thank you so much to all of the attendees who came, because really, from what I heard both of you saying, really the most important piece of all of this are every individual becoming educated, getting involved, paying attention. So I want to thank all of our attendees as well. So thank you, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you
also.
to the Glen Ellen Public Library for hosting us.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.